Well, hopefully, you remember what we talked a little bit about last week. Maybe just a little of it. I know some of you weren't here, but I'm sure you have gone and watched the video, right? That's why Ron puts them up there, you know. Last week, we read Luke's record of Jesus interacting with some of the first people who volunteered to follow him. However, instead of eagerly counting them as his disciples, adding them to that proverbial membership roster, he cautioned them of the dangers and the pain that accompanies going all in to follow him. Jesus warned these first potential disciples, and he warns us, that following him requires our whole selves. We can't hold anything back, but we have to be willing to be completely changed by God. We turn over today to chapter 10, and it shows us why Jesus was so demanding of those who wanted to become his disciples. Have you ever been in a group, just kind of maybe sitting in the back, observing what's happening? That's kind of where I like to be in a group. I remember the first real job that I had, and I'll let you decide just how real of a job it was. I was working in the lawn and garden department of a Sears and Roebuck company in the mall in Rocky Mount. It has since gone out of business, as most Sears have. The first week or so was spent all in the back in the area that the customers never see, going through lesson after lesson of training on the computer, mostly learning about how the cash register worked, and some product knowledge. After all, I had to learn the difference between a Briggs & Stratton powered mower and a Honda mower. Not that any of y'all know about that. I began to mix time on the computer with some time out on the sales floor, shadowing some of the employees who had been there, some literally for about their whole lives. It was kind of scary. Who had been selling lawnmowers for years and years and years. They knew everything. Then one day, my trainer told me I was on my own. You need to make this sale. I was no longer able to hide behind a computer screen or behind another person. It was all up to me. The time of book training is over for these disciples. Remember, it was just in the last chapter, what we read, it suggests that some of these people who Jesus sent out had just started following Jesus. They said, we want to be your disciple. And he said, okay, go. Go and do this work. They had just started following Jesus. They were content to maybe just stay in the shadows, to learn as Jesus did his ministry, as he healed, as he taught, as he ministered. But suddenly he was sending them to do the work of the kingdom. They were suddenly in the deep end. They had to be all in because Jesus was trusting them, empowering them to the forefront of God's actions in the world. As I reflect back on that first job, again, maybe real, maybe not, I know a big part of me would have been content to stay on that computer, learning about the differences between lawnmowers, making minimum wage forever. It was safe. It was controlled. I was in control. I hit that arrow when to go to the next page. But I didn't really start learning about my job. I didn't really learn about how to actually use yard tools. I didn't really learn how to sell something until I was out there talking with the customer, learning what they needed and helping connect them to what they were looking for. Maybe you've been in a similar situation. Though you didn't feel ready, though you would have rather stay put for a little bit longer, it wasn't until you were put out there into the real world that you began to grow into who God was calling you to be. It's often in the painful situations, the scary situations, that we grow the most. God is still sending us today. The call that he gives in this passage from Luke is a specific call to those first disciples who followed him. But it's also a call that's extended to all Christians. And we see that even more at the end of each of the Gospels as Jesus commissions his followers. Even with this call, though, there are signs that it is bigger than these first 70. You may have noticed that some translations render those that were sent out as 70. Some say it's 72. We're not exactly sure which one it was, but you get the general sense. That slight difference in some of the original texts, that's where it comes from, is what Greek they're using, doesn't take away from the significance of that number that was chosen, 70 or 72. You might recognize the number 7. 7 throughout the Bible, beginning at creation, you remember there were 7 days, represented completeness. When you see 7, that's a sign that it's everything. It's a full measure. Likewise, this number could also be a reference to the 70 or 72, again, depending a little bit on translation, the nations that were listed in Genesis 10 after the flood. It represents everyone, everything. Jesus called those original disciples specifically, those specific 70 people in Luke. But in these words, in his selection of that specific number, he also calls out to all of his followers, not just back in 30 AD. This call, by the numbers that Jesus uses, is a call for each of us, all Christians, to go out. Let's look more at just how Jesus called these first disciples. And he calls us to spread the good news. Much like what we read in the last chapter, last week, Jesus doesn't sugarcoat his invitation. Very quickly, he doesn't say, I'm sending you out to feel good and just to have a nice feeling. He says, I am sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves. Now, I do not like very much how Jesus likes to rag on wolves. I think the wolf is a glorious creature. But his meaning is clear. Going out and spreading the gospel is dangerous. Sometimes we lose the significance of a verse like this when we read it in the safety of a sanctuary in a church nestled in the American countryside. We're extremely blessed to live in a place with wide acceptance of Christian values and a deep legacy of religious freedom. After all, that's a lot of what so many of us celebrated this past week on July 4th. Most of us don't have to risk much when we share our faith, when we stand up for the poor, when we demand justice. But this isn't true for a lot of the people in the global church. There are places where the practice of Christianity, and sometimes the practice of any faith, is prohibited. And violations can land you in prison. They can make you lose your job. They can separate you from your family. And sometimes it demands your life. Sometimes following Jesus can lead you to death. Some of our brothers and sisters around the world know what it means to truly be a lamb amongst wolves. And yet they persist. And they persist with joy in the midst of hardship. It's so fascinating to me that it's often in these places where the church is persecuted the most that it grows the greatest. We see that in China right now. The church is just blowing up, even in the midst of government crackdown. Somehow the Spirit of God seems to work in a mighty way in the midst of hardship and persecution. Are you ready to do the work of God in this place, no matter the cost? Perhaps the weirdest thing in this passage for me is that when Jesus says, is when he basically tells these disciples to go into the world unprepared. He tells them to carry nothing, to stop for no one, to expediently go to the places where they have been sent. I really like to be prepared. I like to be ready for any possibility. I like to be in control of my situation. If I have food with me, I don't have to ask anybody for food. Instead, Jesus calls these disciples to trust that those to whom they are sent, the people to whom they are sent, will provide for them. This makes even less sense for me. They are to go and spread the good news, and the very people who they are calling to repentance, the people that they are ministering to, are supposed to take care of them. In some ways, that hasn't changed, has it? I was sent by God to you, and look, you provided. Thank you. You've provided a place to stay, a place or food to eat, resources to pay the bills. As Jesus would say, we have proclaimed peace and you have returned it. Thank you. But how do you receive hospitality from those people that God might be calling you to serve? Again, if you're like me, that might feel a little weird to ask. Why should we depend on those that we are called to serve? I think a lot of it comes back to the fact that Jesus is inviting us to be in relationship to the people to whom we're sent. The work of proclaiming the kingdom of God cannot be one-sided. We have to offer something, yes, we proclaim the gospel, but for there to be a relationship, for there to be trust that is built, we have to be able to receive as well. The relationship of give and take is what builds the trust upon which conversion is built. Who are the people in your lives? Maybe at work, maybe at school, maybe your neighbors or family. Who are those people who need to hear the gospel? How can you deepen your relationship with them by both giving and then receiving hospitality? Especially today, it is almost impossible to share your faith if you aren't in relationship. And we see that all the way back to these first disciples that Jesus sent out. Relationship. As the passage closes, I love the pure joy that Luke records coming from these first disciples. They're amazed, right? They say, Jesus, what you said actually worked. God worked through us. These disciples are equally surprised and overjoyed. In their obedience, God was faithful. But even in their joy, Jesus tempers them. Basically saying, this isn't about you. Great things happened through these disciples, but it's part of something bigger. We only participate in the larger work of God to overcome evil that has been waged throughout time. This isn't something new that we're beginning, but it's something that we get to participate in. We are but details in the story of God, and yet God invites us to be actors in it. Each of us, all of us, are invited to be a part of the joyful, redemptive work of God. Perhaps the most known line of this passage, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. One interesting aspect of that quote is we aren't called to make the plants grow. I have tried to make plants grow, sometimes with success. You can help the plant grow, but ultimately growing the plant is between the plant and its maker. At least that's what I tell myself. God is the one who can work in human hearts. That's not our job. We are simply sent to help and to harvest, to help people act upon what God is already doing in their lives. I'm excited for the ways we are already doing that here at Salem. Several of those opportunities will be this month. Of course, Vacation Bible School starts when? Tonight. We will work to create a place for young ones in our community to see the love of God through us. Thank you to each of you who is laboring so hard on that, and for all of us who support them. I'm also really looking forward to the youth's mission trip down east to support those still recovering from the many hurricanes of the past few years. I've been in one of those hard-hit areas. I've been in those houses where people are simply devastated. And many of them feel like God has abandoned them. By our presence, we proclaim very tangibly, very real, that God has not abandoned these people, that God is with them through the storm. How is God calling you to participate in the work that He is doing in the world? Maybe it's through one of these opportunities that's happening, But maybe there's something else God's putting on your heart here at church or in your community. God is sending us all out to labor in his fields, fields that are ripe for harvest. Let us answer that call, wherever and whoever it takes us to, so that we can know the joy of obeying God. Amen.